She spent 2 years hiding as a nobody, while the man who erased her name built an empire on her work. One mistake, one moment of being seen, dragged her back into a fight she never wanted. This isn't a comeback story. It's a confrontation that changes everything. No one was supposed to notice her. That was the rule she lived by. The first mistake happened the moment Lena Carter, 26 years old, stepped onto the obsidian black floor of the Viridian Room, a private dining hall tucked inside an old restored hotel in downtown Boston. A place where money didn't sparkle, it settled. Where power spoke softly because it had nothing left to prove. Lena blended into that world the way she always did. Shoulders relaxed, eyes lowered, movements precise but forgettable. Her slate-colored uniform fit perfectly, designed to make her disappear among crystal glasses and muted conversations. To everyone else, she was just another server doing her job. But her hands were shaking. Not from fear of the guests, from fear of being recognized. Before we go further, welcome back to Untold Journey Stories, where lives you were never meant to see step out of the shadows. The dining room hummed with quiet confidence. Deals whispered over wine, laughter untouched by consequence. These were people who had never worried about losing everything overnight. Lena moved between tables with practiced grace. She had spent 2 years mastering invisibility. 2 years making sure no one looked twice. No one asked questions. No one connected dots. "Table 9 needs service," the maitre d' murmured. "And keep it smooth. Mr. Ashford doesn't like interruptions." Lena nodded and lifted a bottle that cost more than she earned in weeks. Richard Ashford. The name carried weight in this city, generational wealth, corporate influence, the kind of man whose presence subtly bent a room without effort. She had served his table many times. He had never once looked at her face. That was how she survived. She approached the table, ready to pour and vanish, when a calm voice stopped her. "Excuse me," she turned. Richard Ashford was standing, closer than expected. Tall, controlled. His suit understated but unmistakably expensive. His eyes weren't irritated, they were studying her. "Not for me," he said, gesturing to the woman seated beside him. "My mother's been trying to get your attention." Lena followed his gaze, and her breath caught. Mrs. Ashford sat upright, silver hair pinned neatly, eyes alert and kind. Her hands moved carefully in the air, hesitant but deliberate. Lena recognized the language instantly. Without thinking, she set the bottle down and stepped closer. "Good evening," she signed. "How can I help you?" The woman's face transformed. "Oh, thank goodness," she signed back, relief breaking through her composed exterior. "I was trying to say the seafood tonight reminds me of something I had years ago in Marseille." Lena smiled, a real smile, one she hadn't planned to show. "I'll let the chef know. Would you like me to ask about the seasoning?" Behind her, the room began to shift. Conversation slowed. Chairs stopped moving. People sensed something unusual, though few could name it. Lena didn't notice. For the first time that evening, she wasn't hiding. Mrs. Ashford's hands moved more confidently now as she spoke about travel, about how rare it was for someone to truly listen instead of pretending, about how exhausting it was to be tolerated instead of understood. "You sign beautifully," the woman added. "Where did you learn?" The answer escaped before Lena could stop it. "I studied language systems in college." The silence deepened. "Language systems?" Richard Ashford's voice cut through the air, sharper now. Lena froze. He was no longer looking past her. He was looking at her. "Where?" he asked. Every instinct screamed at her. Deflect. Minimize. Disappear. "It was nothing serious," she said quietly. "Just some classes." Richard stepped closer. "That's not how people with just some classes communicate." Eyes turned. The maitre d' hovered. The room felt suddenly smaller. "I should get back to work," Lena said, reaching for the bottle. "Wait." He caught her wrist. Not aggressively, just enough. The contact sent a shock straight through her chest. Richard released her immediately. "I'm sorry, that was unnecessary." Lena met his gaze, steady despite the pounding in her ears. "Your mother is wonderful," she said softly. "She was telling me about France." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, then something like respect. "She doesn't talk about that much," he said. "She likes you." From the table, Mrs. Ashford smiled knowingly. Lena stepped away, heart racing. As she moved through the dining room, she felt it clearly now. For 2 years, she had been invisible. And in one unguarded moment, she had been seen. She didn't know yet that this was the instant her carefully buried past began pushing back into the light. She didn't know that the man watching her now wouldn't let the questions go. And she didn't know how high the price of being seen was about to become. If you want to know how this single moment unravels everything she fought to protect, make sure you subscribe to Untold Journey Stories. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. Before we continue, here's a question for you. If you were Lena, would you choose A, staying invisible to protect yourself, or B, risking everything by being seen? Comment A or B below. The moment Lena Carter stepped out of the Viridian room and into the cold Boston night, she understood something she hadn't allowed herself to admit inside. Once you are seen, you can never fully disappear again. She walked fast, coat pulled tight, heels striking the pavement with controlled urgency. The city looked the same as it always did. Brick facades, late traffic, the faint smell of the harbor drifting through narrow streets. But her awareness felt sharpened, as if the world had tilted a few degrees off balance. Inside the restaurant, she had broken the rule that kept her safe. She had spoken without permission. She had revealed competence. She had let someone important notice. Back in her studio apartment, Lena leaned against the door and closed her eyes. The silence was heavy, familiar. She dropped her bag, slipped off her shoes, and stood there longer than necessary, waiting for the feeling to pass. It didn't. Her phone vibrated on the counter. Unknown number. Her chest tightened. She stared at the screen, already knowing who it was before she unlocked it. I hope this isn't intrusive. I got your number through the hotel staff directory. I wanted to thank you. My mother hasn't stopped talking about you. Lena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room temperature. Staff directory, of course. She typed a response, deleted it, typed again, deleted that too. Finally, she turned the phone face down and walked to the window, staring out at the narrow alley below. People like Richard Ashford didn't mean harm when they crossed boundaries. They simply assumed access, and assumptions were dangerous. Sleep came in fragments. Every time she drifted off, she saw hands moving in the air, saw a room falling silent, felt the weight of attention settle on her skin. By morning, she knew pretending this hadn't happened would be a mistake. On her way to her day job, she stopped at a small cafe near the transit line, ordered coffee she barely tasted, and sat in the corner scrolling through headlines she had trained herself not to read. Business news, tech updates, corporate movements that once defined her entire world. Her thumb hesitated, then typed a name she hadn't searched in nearly 3 years. Victor Lang. The page loaded. Her breath caught. The photo showed a familiar face, slightly older, sharper around the edges, standing confidently in front of a backdrop of logos. Beneath it, the headline read, Atlas Vector announces strategic acquisition talks with Ashford Holdings. Lena's hands went cold. Atlas Vector. She knew that company. Not from the news, from memory, from late nights and whiteboards and code she had written when the future still felt negotiable. The article went on about innovation, proprietary systems, advanced modeling, language so close to her own it felt like someone else wearing her voice. This wasn't coincidence. Victor Lang didn't make careless moves, and if Ashford Holdings was circling Atlas Vector now, it meant 2 separate parts of her past were converging in ways she had worked very hard to prevent. Her phone buzzed again. Richard Ashford. I hope I didn't make you uncomfortable last night. That wasn't my intention. Would you be willing to meet for lunch? Somewhere public. No pressure. Lena stared at the message. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore it, to block the number, to move again if she had to. Disappearing had kept her alive once, but something else stirred beneath the fear. Something sharper. Tired. She was exhausted from shrinking, from watching other people build reputations on work she recognized as her own, from carrying knowledge that could clear her name while pretending she was no one. Lunch didn't mean trust. It didn't mean forgiveness. It didn't mean she owed Richard Ashford anything. It meant control. She typed slowly, carefully. Lunch is fine. Tomorrow, somewhere simple. The reply came almost instantly. Perfect. Lena set the phone down and closed her eyes. Her heart was racing, but beneath it was something she hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity. If Victor Lang was involved with Ashford Holdings, then Richard's interest in her wasn't random. Questions would follow. And whether she liked it or not, She was already standing at the edge of a confrontation she had spent years avoiding. The mistake wasn't being seen. The mistake was believing she could stay hidden forever. As she finished her coffee and stood to leave, Lena understood that whatever happened next would force her to make a choice she could no longer delay. Remain invisible and let others control the story, or step forward and risk everything to reclaim it. That night, after agreeing to lunch, Lena understood there was no turning back, because the past she had buried so carefully was no longer waiting quietly, it was knocking. She didn't go straight home. Instead, she walked the long way through streets she rarely used, letting the city exhaust her body so her mind couldn't race ahead. But the memories came anyway, uninvited and sharp, slipping through the cracks she'd worked so hard to seal. There had been a time when she didn't measure her steps, when her name carried weight instead of risk. 3 years earlier, Lena Carter had occupied a corner office with glass walls and whiteboards filled with equations only a handful of people in the city truly understood. She hadn't been a server moving silently between tables. She had been a systems architect, a strategist, the person investors leaned toward when they wanted real answers instead of polished optimism. And standing beside her back then was Victor Lang. They had met the way ambitious people often do, through shared obsession, long nights, half-eaten takeout, arguments that sharpened ideas instead of breaking trust. Victor had been charming, persuasive, endlessly confident in his vision. Lena had been the one who made that vision functional. Where he spoke, she built. Where he promised, she delivered. Atlas Vector had started in a rented workspace with unreliable heat and borrowed chairs. Lena had written the first models on her own laptop, refining systems that could predict risk patterns months ahead of market shifts. Victor had handled introductions, funding conversations, the public narrative. Together, they had looked unstoppable, until the balance tipped. The first signs were subtle. Documents rewritten without her knowledge, meetings rescheduled so she couldn't attend. Her name moved lower on presentations, then missing entirely. When she questioned it, Victor smiled and told her she was imagining things, that pressure made people paranoid. She believed him. The moment she realized the truth came too late to stop it. A compliance inquiry, accusations framed as concern, emails selectively forwarded. By the time Lena understood what was happening, Victor had positioned himself as the betrayed founder and her as the liability. He froze her access. He refiled internal records. He spoke calmly while her world collapsed. The investigation ended without charges, but that was part of the strategy. No verdict meant no exoneration. The industry didn't need proof. Suspicion was enough. Atlas Vector survived. Lena didn't. That was when she learned how easy it was to erase a person without ever raising your voice. Back in her apartment, Lena unlocked the narrow metal box hidden beneath her bed. She hadn't opened it in months. Inside were things she couldn't afford to keep visible. Old credentials, archived files, a sealed drive labeled only with a date. She sat on the floor and opened her laptop, hesitating before typing in the password she had sworn never to use again. The screen filled with folders she knew by heart. Source code histories, version logs, time-stamped iterations that mapped every step of the work Atlas Vector now claimed as proprietary innovation. Proof. She closed the laptop quickly, as if the glow itself might draw attention. Proof only mattered if someone was willing to see it, and that was the danger. Lunch with Richard Ashford wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was proximity. And proximity, she had learned, invited leverage. The next day arrived too quickly. They met at a small bistro near the river, far from boardrooms and quiet luxury. Richard stood when he saw her, his demeanor careful, restrained. There was no entitlement in his greeting, no assumption of access, just curiosity sharpened by intelligence. "I want to be clear," Lena said after they ordered. "I didn't agree to this because I want something." "I assumed as much," Richard replied. "I'm here because something about last night didn't add up." She studied him, searching for the familiar signs. Calculation, performance. But what she saw instead unsettled her more. Attention. "My mother has spent years being spoken around," he continued. "People don't bother to learn how to reach her. You did, and you did it without knowing who I was." Lena looked down at her hands. "That doesn't make me special." "No," Richard said quietly, "but it makes you honest." She almost laughed. Honesty had cost her everything once. I did some research, he added, not apologetically, but transparently. Your background doesn't match the job you're doing. There it was. Lena felt the old instinct rise, the reflex to retreat, but she forced herself to stay still. And you think that gives you the right to answers? I think it gives me a reason to ask, he said. Especially now. Now? Atlas Vector is in talks with my firm. The words landed exactly where she feared they would. Lena leaned back, the weight of the past settling fully into the present. Then you already know who Victor Lang is. Yes, Richard said. What I don't know is why every trace of your involvement seems to have vanished. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Lena spoke, because he made sure it did. For the first time in years, she told the story out loud. Not the sanitized version, not the careful one, the truth, sharp and complete. Richard listened without interruption. When she finished, he didn't offer sympathy. He didn't offer comfort. He asked one question. Do you still have the work? Lena met his gaze. Yes. In that moment, she understood the risk she was taking. Trust had once been the weapon used against her. But hiding had only allowed the lie to survive. And if Victor Lang was moving closer again, then silence was no longer safety. It was surrender. By the time Lena finished speaking, the truth no longer felt like a memory. It felt like a line drawn in the present, and Richard Ashford was standing directly in front of it. He didn't rush to fill the silence that followed her last sentence. Outside the bistro window, the river moved steadily, indifferent to the weight of what had just been said. Lena had expected disbelief, or polite distancing, or the familiar suggestion that maybe things were more complicated than she remembered. Instead, Richard leaned back slightly and exhaled. So he didn't just take credit, he said. He erased you. Lena nodded. He didn't need to destroy me publicly. He just needed to make sure no one would listen if I ever spoke. Richard's jaw tightened. The shift was subtle, but she noticed it. This wasn't outrage on her behalf. It was recognition. The kind that comes when a pattern finally reveals itself. I've spent my career evaluating risk, he said after a moment. Markets, people, institutions. Most damage doesn't come from chaos. It comes from someone who understands systems well enough to manipulate them quietly. Lena looked at him carefully. And now you're wondering if you're about to merge with someone like that. I'm wondering, Richard corrected, if I already am. He didn't ask her to convince him. He didn't demand proof. That restraint unsettled her more than skepticism would have. People who needed to be persuaded were predictable. People who chose to verify were not. I want to show you something, he said, standing. Not here. She hesitated. Old instincts flared. Movement had consequences. Visibility had consequences. But she followed him anyway. Richard's office occupied the upper floors of a steel and glass building near the financial district, removed from the historic charm of downtown Boston and firmly planted in the present. Everything about the space spoke of precision rather than excess. Clean lines, neutral tones, a view that commanded without showing off. His assistant barely glanced at Lena as they passed. Richard closed the door behind them himself. I haven't told my board about you, he said, and I haven't told Victor about my concerns. Lena's pulse quickened. You're already choosing sides. I'm choosing integrity, he replied evenly. The sides will sort themselves out. He pulled up a series of documents on his screen and turned it toward her. Patent filings, technical summaries, development timelines. Lena didn't need long to recognize them. Her work, not copied line for line, but translated, adjusted, cleaned just enough to look original. The architecture beneath it was unmistakable. These were all filed within months of each other, Richard said. Claimed to be developed internally over 3 years. That timeline didn't sit right with me even before I met you. You wouldn't have found my name, Lena said quietly. No, he agreed. Which is exactly what troubled me. He looked at her then, fully, as if weighing something far heavier than a business decision. If what you're saying is true, he said, then Atlas Vector isn't just overstating its value. It's built on theft. And if you proceed with the acquisition, Lena replied, you become the one legitimizing it. The words hung between them, sharp and unavoidable. Richard turned back to the screen. There's a meeting on Monday, final diligence before the board vote. Lena felt her chest tighten. And Victor? He believes everything is on track. Silence again. Then Richard said, "I want you there." Her breath caught. "That's not possible." "It is," he said, "as an external consultant, independent verification. He'll recognize me." "Yes," Richard said simply, "and that matters." Fear surged, hot and immediate. You don't understand what he's capable of when he feels cornered. Richard met her gaze without flinching. I understand what he's capable of when he isn't. The confidence in his voice wasn't bravado. It was grounded, measured. "I won't force you," he continued. "This isn't a trap. It's an opportunity, but only if you're willing to stop running." Lena turned away, staring out at the city below. She had rebuilt herself once by disappearing. It had kept her alive, but it had also kept her small. "What happens if I do this?" she asked, "and he denies everything?" "Then we document the denial," Richard said, "and we keep going. And if he tries to discredit me again, then he does it in a room where I'm watching." She closed her eyes. 2 years ago, no one had watched. "I need to be clear," Lena said finally. "If I step into that room, I don't want sympathy. I want accountability." Richard nodded. "That's the only thing I'm interested in." She turned back to him. In his expression, she didn't see savior or hero. She saw something far rarer. A man willing to burn a profitable path if it was built on a lie. "Then I'll do it," she said. Richard's shoulders eased, just slightly. "Good, because once we open this door, Victor Lang won't be able to close it again." As Lena left the building that evening, the city felt different. Louder, sharper, more real. She wasn't invisible anymore, and for the first time she wasn't facing what came next alone. Once Lena agreed to step into that room, the story stopped being about the past and became about strategy. The shift was immediate and unsettling. Richard didn't treat what came next as a dramatic confrontation or a moral crusade. He treated it like preparation for a high-stakes operation, one that required precision, restraint, and patience. And that, more than anything else, told Lena this wasn't symbolic support. This was commitment. They didn't meet again in public. The next 2 days unfolded quietly, deliberately, inside Richard's office, and later inside a smaller conference room that overlooked nothing but concrete and sky. No assistants, no casual conversations, just work. Lena brought the lockbox. She hesitated before opening it, her fingers lingering on the clasp as if the past itself might surge out once it was exposed. Richard waited without comment, without pressure. When she finally lifted the lid, the room seemed to narrow. Inside were drives, printed documents, notebooks worn soft at the edges. Not nostalgia, evidence. She laid everything out slowly, development logs, early prototypes, time-stamped architecture diagrams that mapped the evolution of systems Atlas Vector now marketed as revolutionary breakthroughs. Richard didn't interrupt. He watched absorbed, occasionally asking a question that cut straight to the point. Who had access to this version? Only Victor and me. Where was it stored? On my personal machine and an encrypted backup, he insisted we mirror internally. That insistence, Richard said quietly, wasn't accidental. No, Lena replied. It was rehearsed. They worked late into the night, cross-referencing filings with original timestamps, tracking inconsistencies so subtle most people wouldn't notice them unless they knew exactly what they were looking for. Lena felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and clarity. For years, she had carried this alone, unsure whether it would ever matter. Now every detail found its place in a larger structure. This wasn't revenge. It was reconstruction. On the third day, Richard outlined the plan. Victor would be invited to present his lead innovations in person. The absence of his so-called research team would be noted, but not challenged directly. Not yet. Lena would attend as an external consultant, introduced without context, her role framed narrowly and professionally. She doesn't exist, Lena said flatly. Not to him. That's exactly why this works, Richard replied. The goal wasn't exposure through confrontation. It was collapse through contradiction. Victor's strength had always been narrative control. Take that away, and the rest would follow. Still, doubt crept in when the room grew quiet. What if he's prepared? Lena asked one night as they reviewed the final sequence. What if he's already rewritten everything again? Richard leaned back, considering. Then he's already afraid. She looked at him. You sound certain. I am, he said, because people who win by erasure can't tolerate witnesses. That word stayed with her. Witness. On Sunday evening, Lena stood in her apartment staring at her reflection, hardly recognizing the woman looking back. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She wasn't trying to disappear. Her clothes were simple, intentional. Not armor, not disguise, just clarity. She thought about the first time she had trusted Victor, how easy it had been, how quickly admiration had blurred into dependence, how long it had taken to realize that love, when paired with ambition, could become a weapon. Her phone buzzed. "Richard, tomorrow won't be easy. You don't owe anyone composure. Just truth." She stared at the message, then typed back, "I'm not doing this to hurt him. I know. I'm doing it to stop him." The response came almost immediately. "That's why it matters." Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it brought fragments, boardrooms, whiteboards erased mid-sentence, her name fading from documents she had written. She woke before dawn, heart pounding, then sat quietly until the feeling passed. By the time she arrived at Richard's building, the city was already awake. Monday moved fast. So did consequences. In the elevator, neither of them spoke. The quiet felt intentional, grounding. When the doors opened, Richard placed a hand briefly on her shoulder. "Whatever happens," he said, "you walk out of this intact." Lena nodded. For the first time in years, she believed that might be possible. The plan didn't rely on Victor's guilt. It relied on his habits, his tendency to over-explain, to dominate conversations, to assume no one else in the room had the context to challenge him. And Lena had learned something else during those long nights of preparation. The most dangerous moment for someone who lives by manipulation isn't exposure. It's the instant they realize the story no longer belongs to them. As they stepped into the conference room, Lena felt fear, yes, but beneath it was something steadier. Readiness. Whatever Victor Lang walked in expecting, it wasn't the woman he had erased, and that, she knew, was already the beginning of the end. The moment Victor Lang walked into the conference room, Lena knew the plan had already begun to work. He entered with the ease of a man accustomed to control, smiling broadly, greeting the board members by name, radiating the kind of confidence that comes from believing the story is already written in your favor. His suit was impeccable, his posture relaxed. To anyone watching casually, this was a founder about to finalize a triumph. Then his eyes shifted. For a fraction of a second, just long enough for Lena to catch it, the smile faltered. It was subtle. Most people would have missed it. But she had once loved this man. She knew every micro-expression, every pause he used to recalibrate when something threatened his narrative. He hadn't expected her. "Good morning," Richard said evenly, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Victor, thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lena Carter, an independent systems consultant we've brought in to review Atlas Vector's proprietary models." The word independent landed hard. Victor recovered quickly, his expression smoothing into polite curiosity. "Of course," he said, always happy to have fresh eyes. But his gaze didn't leave Lena. She met it calmly. No challenge, no accusation, just presence. The presentation began. Victor spoke with practiced fluency, outlining growth projections, innovation pipelines, and the technological backbone that supposedly set Atlas Vector apart. Slides advanced, charts climbed upward, heads around the table nodded. Lena listened, saying nothing. She recognized the architecture immediately, not because it was familiar in a general sense, but because it followed the same decision paths she had once mapped herself. The same assumptions, the same safeguards, the same fingerprints hidden beneath polished language. Richard let Victor finish. Then he leaned forward slightly. "Thank you. Before we move on, Dr. Carter has a few technical questions." Victor smiled. "Of course." Lena opened her folder and slid a single document across the table. "In your risk modeling framework," she said evenly, "you reference an adaptive feedback loop introduced during what you call Phase 2 development. Could you explain how that loop was trained?" Victor answered immediately, too immediately. "We ran it through a proprietary dataset developed internally over several years." "Interesting," Lena replied, "because the loop relies on a weighting structure that only stabilizes when trained on volatile market conditions from a very specific window, a window that closed 4 years ago." Silence flickered around the table. Victor chuckled softly. "Markets are volatile all the time." "They are," Lena agreed. "But that structure only converges when exposed to pre-correction anomalies from that period. Without them, the model collapses." She turned another page. Would you like me to demonstrate? Richard nodded. Please. Lena connected her drive to the screen. The room darkened slightly as the system loaded. She ran the model using Atlas Vector's claimed parameters. The graph spiked, then failed. A murmur spread. Victor leaned forward now. This must be a configuration issue. Perhaps, Lena said. Let's try the original configuration. She changed nothing but the dataset source. The model stabilized instantly. Lena looked up. This dataset originated from my personal development environment, timestamp crypted and archived 3 years before Atlas Vector filed its first patent. The room went very quiet. Victor's smile disappeared. That's a serious accusation, he said tightly. It's a verifiable statement, Lena replied. And it's not the only one. She opened another file, then another. Development notes, version histories, internal emails pulled from archive backups, complete with metadata showing authorship, access logs, and modification trails. Richard spoke calmly. Our legal team has reviewed this material. The patent filings submitted by Atlas Vector show systematic alterations to inventor attribution and development timelines. Victor stood abruptly. This is absurd. Anyone can fabricate documents. Anyone can, Richard said, but fabricating a complete version history across multiple independent systems without detection is extraordinarily difficult, especially when the original signatures still exist. Victor's gaze darted around the room. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Lena stood then, not raising her voice, not performing. You didn't just take my work, she said. You took my credibility. You rewrote contracts. You froze access. You let suspicion do what outright accusations couldn't. Victor laughed, sharp and brittle. You were unstable. You were a risk. I was inconvenient, Lena corrected. There's a difference. Richard closed his folder. There will be no acquisition, effective immediately. Furthermore, we'll be forwarding our findings to the appropriate authorities and notifying all current and prospective partners. Victor's composure shattered. You can't do this. We already have, Richard replied. Victor turned to Lena, his voice dropping. We could have worked this out. Lena looked at him, feeling no anger now, only clarity. You had years to do the right thing. Security appeared at the door, summoned quietly. As Victor was escorted out, the room remained silent. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Richard looked at Lena. Are you okay? She exhaled slowly. The weight she had carried for years lifted, not dramatically, but decisively. Yes, she said. I am. For the first time since her name had been erased, it had been spoken aloud in a room that mattered. And this time, the truth had witnesses. When the conference room finally emptied, what remained wasn't triumph or celebration, but a quiet stillness that marked the end of something long and heavy. Lena stood by the window in Richard's office, watching the city move as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Cars flowed, pedestrians hurried. Somewhere, meetings began and ended without anyone knowing that a carefully constructed lie had just collapsed several floors above them. Richard didn't speak right away. He gave her space, the way he always had, never rushing her through moments that mattered. They'll move quickly now, he said at last. Legal review, public disclosures, restitution. It won't be clean, but it will be thorough. Lena nodded. She understood processes. She understood that justice, unlike revenge, moved slowly and deliberately. I don't need to watch it, she said. I just needed it to stop. Richard looked at her with something close to admiration. Most people don't realize how rare that clarity is. The weeks that followed were quieter than she expected. No dramatic headlines, no public spectacle, just methodical corrections. Filings amended, patents reassigned, contracts revised to reflect a truth that should have been there from the beginning. Atlas Vector unraveled without her having to touch it again. Lena returned to the Viridian room once, long enough to give notice. The manager barely looked up, distracted by staffing schedules and weekend reservations. No one asked why she was leaving. No one needed an explanation. In a way, that anonymity felt fitting. She moved forward without ceremony. A small workspace came first, then a handful of carefully chosen collaborators, people who asked questions, people who listened, people who didn't confuse confidence with competence. Richard never tried to insert himself where he didn't belong. He offered resources when she asked, distance when she needed it. They learned each other slowly, deliberately, without illusions. One evening, months later, They stood in her office after everyone else had gone home. Whiteboards filled with ideas that were hers again. Her name on the door, unambiguous and earned. I used to think rebuilding meant returning to who I was before, Lena said, staring at the city lights beyond the glass. But I don't want that version of myself anymore. Richard leaned against the desk. Who do you want to be now? She smiled, just slightly. Someone who doesn't confuse silence with safety. He nodded. That sounds like progress. The legal process concluded quietly. Victor Lang pled out rather than face trial. The terms were severe enough to ensure he wouldn't be in a position to repeat his methods, but Lena didn't follow the details closely. She had learned that healing didn't come from watching someone else fall. It came from building something that could stand. On a clear autumn morning, Richard asked her to join him for coffee near the river where they had first spoken honestly. The air was crisp. The city felt awake but unhurried. I've been meaning to ask you something, he said, his tone careful in a way that immediately caught her attention. She raised an eyebrow. That sounds dangerous, he smiled. Probably. They walked in silence for a moment before he stopped and turned to face her. There was no audience, no preparation, just sincerity. I don't believe in grand gestures, he said. You already know that, but I believe in choosing someone with intention. Lena felt her pulse quicken, not from fear, but recognition. I don't want to be another person who benefits from your strength without offering you partnership in return, he continued. And I don't want to build anything meaningful without you standing beside me. He reached into his pocket, not dramatically, not theatrically, just honestly. Lena Carter, he said, steady and certain, will you marry me? For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to that question. Not because it was overwhelming, but because it was clear. She thought about the woman she had been when she learned how to disappear, about the cost of that survival, about the risk of being seen again. Yes, she said without hesitation. I will. He didn't pull her into a performance of joy. He simply exhaled, relief and happiness blending into something quiet and enduring, and took her hand. They stood there longer than necessary, watching the river move forward without urgency. Later, as the city settled into evening, Lena thought about the strange symmetry of it all, how losing everything had stripped her down to what mattered, how being erased had taught her the value of being known on her own terms. She hadn't been saved, she had been believed, and that, she knew now, was the beginning of a life that no one could rewrite without her consent. What makes this story linger isn't the courtroom victory or the corporate downfall. It's the quiet transformation that happens long before the truth is spoken out loud. Lena's journey is not simply about reclaiming stolen work. It is about reclaiming authorship over her own life. For a long time, survival meant shrinking, staying silent, blending in just enough to avoid being hurt again. That strategy kept her safe, but it also kept her frozen in place. The world moved forward using her ideas, her labor, her intelligence, while she learned to measure her worth by how invisible she could become. And that is the hardest truth this story reveals. Injustice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it succeeds not because it is powerful, but because the person it targets grows tired of fighting and chooses silence instead. What changed everything wasn't confrontation at first. It was belief. Someone saw Lena clearly and chose to listen without demanding she perform her pain or justify her worth. That moment of being believed did not erase fear, but it gave her something more valuable than confidence. It gave her permission to stop running. The deeper lesson here is not about revenge or even justice in a legal sense. It's about integrity, both personal and collective. When systems reward those who manipulate quietly, it becomes easy to confuse success with legitimacy. But real progress only happens when someone is willing to pause, look closer, and ask uncomfortable questions, even when doing so threatens convenience or profit. For anyone listening, the application is not to wait for a billionaire ally or a dramatic moment of vindication. It is far simpler and far more difficult. It begins with refusing to erase yourself. It means keeping records of your work, honoring your instincts when something feels wrong, and understanding that silence, while sometimes necessary, should never become your permanent identity. It also means recognizing when to ask for help. Strength is not measured by how much you endure alone, but by how willing you are to step into the light when the moment requires it. Healing does not come from watching those who hurt you fall. It comes from building something honest that they can no longer control. If this story resonates, ask yourself one question. Where in your life have you been choosing silence when what you really need is clarity? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please share your perspective in the comments so others can learn from your experience. And if stories like this matter to you, don't forget to subscribe to Untold Journey Stories. Your support helps us continue sharing journeys that remind us all what courage, integrity, and truth really look like.